A boardroom in Boston. Glass walls, leather chairs, a view that cost more than most people earned in a year. James Williams stood at the center of it all. All, a black man in work boots and a clean flannel shirt, holding a piece of paper folded carefully against his chest. Reporters pressed against the windows outside, camera flashes strobing through the expensive glass like lightning caught in a bottle. Richard Ashford sat at the head of the table, silver hair perfect, charcoal suit pressed, the expression of a man performing reluctant duty. He had just finished his presentation. Timeline, travel records, photographs taken by investigators James had never seen. The marriage, Richard declared with practiced gravity, was a sham designed to circumvent the legitimate terms of his brother's will. James felt the weight of every eye in that room. Board members, lawyers, Elizabeth's assistant, Amanda, pale and clutching her tablet like a shield. He had not been invited to speak. No one had coached him or prepared remarks, but he stepped forward anyway, past the podium, past the woman he had married 2 days ago, and stood in front of people who had already decided what kind of man he was. His hands were clean, but the calluses showed. His voice, when it came, was the same voice he used to read bedtime stories to his daughter, calm, unhurried, carrying the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything worth protecting. Everything he just said is true. He let the silence settle, let them absorb it. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded paper, opening it with the care reserved for something fragile and irreplaceable. A child's drawing, 3 people standing in front of a house, rendered in crayon with the unsteady confidence only 6-year-olds possess. My daughter drew this at school last week. 3 people in front of a house, me, her, and a woman she calls Daddy's friend. He held it up. The cameras outside captured it through the glass. Somewhere in that room, someone's breath caught. I'm standing here because I don't want to tell my little girl that the woman in her picture isn't real. The title card appeared then, white letters over black, stark and simple. 17 days earlier. The farm in Hartfield, Vermont looked the way it had looked every morning for the past 4 years. A white 2-story house with a wraparound porch that needed paint. A red barn that had weathered better than the house because James had prioritized the animals over aesthetics. Pasture fencing that ran to the tree line where maples and birches stood sentinel against the mountains beyond. The kind of place people from cities imagined when they thought about escaping, before they remembered that escape required work, that quiet demanded endurance, that peace was something you built with your hands every single day. James woke at 5 in the morning because the animals did not care about sleep schedules. He pulled on jeans worn soft at the knees, a thermal shirt that had belonged to someone else in another life, and boots with cracked leather at the toe that still held, because good boots, properly cared for, outlasted most things that mattered. He moved through the dark house without turning on lights, navigating by memory and the faint glow of the clock on the stove. The kitchen was small, a table for 4 that sat 2 now. Cabinets Michelle had painted pale yellow the summer before she got sick, back when painting cabinets seemed like the kind of problem worth solving. James reached for the coffee pot on the second shelf, the old percolator that had belonged to Michelle's grandmother, the one piece of her family he had kept after the funeral, when her mother had quietly, methodically reclaimed everything else. He filled it with water from the tap, measured grounds with the precision of a man who had learned that routine could be armor, that small, predictable acts built scaffolding against chaos. While it brewed, he stood at the window and watched the sky lighten over the eastern ridge, gray bleeding into pale blue, the patient mathematics of dawn. On the porch, Emma was already awake. She sat on the top step with her sketchpad balanced on her knees, a shoebox of crayons spread beside her like treasure. 6 years old, dark curls pulled into 2 puffs her grandmother Patricia had taught him to make, brown skin smooth and sleep-warm in the early light. She drew the same things most mornings: the barn, the horses, the mountains, their dog Copper, a 2-year-old retriever who lay beside her now with his chin resting on her bare foot, golden fur catching the first rays of sun. James poured coffee into his thermos, grabbed the pill organizer from the counter, and stepped outside. The screen door creaked. Copper's tail thumped twice against the porch boards, but the dog did not move, loyal to his post beside the small human who fed him scraps and told him secrets. "Morning, baby girl." Emma looked up, smiled, gap-toothed, and easy. "Morning, Daddy. I'm drawing Dutch. You think he looks good in purple?" James crouched beside her, knees protesting slightly, and studied the picture. Dutch the gelding, rendered in violet crayon with legs like tree trunks and a mane that defied physics. In Emma's world, horses could be any color, the sky could be orange, houses floated if you wanted them to. "I think Dutch looks excellent in purple, very distinguished." He opened the pill organizer, pulled out the small white tablet from the Monday compartment, and held it out. Emma took it without complaint, popped it in her mouth, and reached for the juice box James had brought out on autopilot. Muscle memory from a year of mornings exactly like this one. She drank, swallowed, went back to her drawing. The pill was for her heart. A murmur, the cardiologist had called it, when Emma collapsed at school 14 months ago, 6 months after they buried Michelle. A small defect, a hole that might close on its own as she grew, or might require surgery when she was older. 10, maybe 12. They would monitor it, keep her calm, avoid stress, make sure she took her medication every morning and stayed within 45 minutes of Burlington Medical Center, where Dr. Rebecca Foster kept Emma's file in a drawer marked "Active Monitoring," and returned James's calls within an hour, day or night. James had chosen this farm not because it was peaceful, though it was, not because it was where Michelle had grown up, though that mattered. He had chosen it because it was close enough to the hospital and far enough from the chaos that had killed his wife. Boston, the highways, the noise, the stress of a city that ground people down while promising them everything. Michelle had been an architect, James a structural engineer. They had met at MIT, married at 25, built a life that looked from the outside like success. A Back Bay apartment, careers that paid well, plans for children, for travel, for all the tomorrows people counted on before they learned how fast tomorrow could be taken away. The ovarian cancer diagnosis came on a Tuesday in March. Stage 3, aggressive. The kind of words doctors delivered in quiet voices as if softness could blunt the blow. James had resigned from his firm within a week, sold the apartment within a month, liquidated retirement accounts, cashed out stock options, turned his back on a partnership offer that would have made him one of the youngest senior engineers in the company's history. None of it mattered, not the salary, not the prestige, not the glass office with his name on the door. Michelle wanted to come home, to the place where she had learned to ride horses and swim in cold lakes and sleep under skies so thick with stars they looked like spilled salt. So James had brought her home. 18 months of chemo, of hospital visits, of good days and bad days, and days that blurred together into a single ache. And then she was gone, and James was alone on a farm in Vermont with a 5-year-old daughter, and a silence so profound it felt like drowning. He had thought about leaving, going back to Boston, to work, to the life that made sense on paper. But then Emma collapsed, and the doctors found the murmur, and James understood with cold clarity that the farm was not a retreat. It was a fortress, the only place where he could control the variables, manage the risks, keep his daughter safe in a world that had already taken too much. The coffee was strong and bitter. James drank it standing at the porch rail, looking out over land that was his because Michelle's family had not wanted it, had sold it to him for $1 and a promise to keep the headstones by the eastern fence line clean. Her great-grandparents, her grandfather, graves older than the house, marked with stones that leaned slightly, settling into the earth the way everything did eventually. Have you ever loved someone so much that losing them once already feels like all you can survive? The thought came unbidden, sharp, and unwelcome. James pushed it away. Emma was healthy. The medication worked. Dr. Foster was cautious but optimistic. There was no reason to borrow trouble from a future that might never come. He had learned that much from Michelle. You could not control the cancer. You could not negotiate with the cells that multiplied in the dark. All you could do was show up, be present, love as hard as you could for as long as you were allowed. He finished his coffee, told Emma to stay where Copper could see her, walked down to check the fence line along the north pasture, where the posts had a tendency to shift in spring when the ground thawed and contracted. The work was simple, physical, the kind of labor that required attention but not thought, hands and back, and the comfortable ache of muscles used properly. By the time he finished, the sun was fully up and the day had settled into its rhythm. That was when he heard the engine, not a truck, not a tractor, something smoother, heavier, expensive, the kind of sound that did not belong on a dirt road in rural Vermont. James straightened, wiped his hands on his jeans, and watched a black Cadillac Escalade roll up the long driveway, dust billowing behind it like a small localized storm. It stopped near the barn. The engine cut, the passenger door opened, and a young woman stepped out, auburn hair cut short, a tablet clutched against her chest like a talisman. She looked around the property with the cautious curiosity of someone who had driven a long way to a place they were not entirely sure they should be. The rear door opened. A woman emerged. Tall, early 30s, dark hair pulled back in a flawless twist. She wore a cashmere coat over tailored slacks and heels that had no business on a farm. When she stepped onto the gravel, one heel sank 2 inches into the soft ground beside the driveway. She looked down, frowned with the expression of someone for whom mud was simply not a relevant factor, and looked up again. Her gaze found James across the yard, and she did not look away. James walked toward them. He moved without hurry, the way he always moved, without the performance of urgency that marked people who lived in cities. He studied the car, the assistant clutching her tablet, the driver still sitting behind the wheel with the engine off, hands on the steering wheel like he was waiting for instructions. And then he studied the woman herself, beautiful in a way that felt constructed, deliberate, every detail managed, hair, clothes, posture. She looked like someone who had spent her life learning to control the room before she entered it. James stopped a few feet away, close enough to be polite, far enough to make clear that this was his land, his space, his terms. "Ma'am, if you're here to buy my land, it's not for sale." The woman's expression did not shift. No frustration, no surprise. She simply looked at him the way you might look at a contract that needed negotiating. "I'm not here for your land, Mr. Williams." She knew his name. That told James everything he needed to know about how thoroughly she had prepared for this visit. "Then what are you here for?" The assistant leaned close, whispered something James could not hear. The woman ignored her. She took a step forward, heel pulling free from the mud with a soft sound, and extended her hand. "My name is Elizabeth Ashford. I'd like to speak with you privately, if you'll allow it. James looked at her hand. Clean nails, no rings, skin that had never seen manual labor. He shook it anyway because his mother had raised him to be polite, even to strangers who arrived unannounced in expensive cars. We can talk on the porch. He led them toward the house. Emma looked up from her drawing as they approached, curiosity bright in her eyes. She studied Elizabeth with the frank, unguarded assessment only children possess, the kind of looking that makes adults uncomfortable because it sees too much. You're really pretty. Are you a princess? The assistant, Amanda, smiled behind her tablet. Elizabeth opened her mouth, closed it, and seemed genuinely uncertain for the first time since stepping out of the Escalade. I'm not a princess. Emma considered this. You look like one. Princesses wear pretty clothes and have shiny hair. Thank you. That's very kind. James gestured to the two wooden chairs he had built the winter after Michelle died, needing something to do with his hands during the long nights when Emma slept and the house felt too empty. The chairs sat beside a planter box filled with flowers Michelle had put in the ground 4 springs ago, purple and white blooms that came back every year without anyone tending them, stubborn and faithful as grief. Elizabeth sat. The assistant remained standing, tablet ready, as if this were a boardroom and not a farmer's porch. James took the other chair, angled so he could see both Elizabeth and Emma, who had gone back to her drawing, but was clearly listening to every word. Elizabeth did not ease into it. No small talk, no pleasantries. She simply began, her voice steady and businesslike, the tone of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. Her father, Henry Ashford, had built Ashford Properties from a single office in downtown Boston into a company that developed luxury residential towers across the Northeast. Hotels, condominiums, mixed-use developments that reshaped skylines. He had died 2 years ago, a heart attack at his desk on a Tuesday afternoon, alone in his office, because Elizabeth had been in London closing a deal. In his will, he had included a clause no one expected. If Elizabeth did not marry before her 33rd birthday, controlling interest in the company would transfer to her uncle, Richard Ashford, currently vice chairman of the board of directors. Her birthday was in 17 days. She needed a legal marriage, not a relationship, not love, a contract. She had lawyers who had prepared terms, compensation, a clean divorce after 12 months. She needed someone outside her world, someone with no connections to her industry, no interest in her money, no agenda that could complicate things later. Her legal team had conducted a search and produced a shortlist. James Williams had come up at the top. Former engineer, MIT graduate, clean record, no debts, no criminal history, living off the grid on a farm in rural Vermont. From a legal standpoint, he was ideal. James listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the apple trees at the edge of the property, carrying the smell of grass and earth and something sweet that had no name. In the barn, one of the horses stamped its foot, impatient for feed. Why me? You could find 100 men in Boston willing to do this. Respect flickered across Elizabeth's features, brief but unmistakable. Every man in my circle has his own angle, shares, business relationships, media exposure. I need someone who wants nothing from me, someone who has nothing to gain or lose from my world. James felt the temperature in his chest drop, warmth draining out, the way color drains from sky before a storm. His eyes cooled. The polite mask he wore for strangers slipped, revealing the bedrock underneath. You ran a background check on me before you drove 3 hours to my farm. It was not a question. Elizabeth did not apologize. I run background checks on everyone I do business with. I'm not a business deal, ma'am. The words came out quiet, but they landed with weight. Elizabeth held his gaze, and the space between them became a negotiation conducted in silence. Then she named a figure. $200,000 for 12 months, paid in full upon completion of the contract. Divorce paperwork handled by her attorneys. No complications, no strings, no entanglements beyond what the law required. James was silent. Out on the porch, Emma ran to show Amanda a drawing of a horse with wings. The assistant crouched down and admired it with genuine warmth, her smile soft and unguarded. The scene looked ordinary enough, just a child sharing her artwork on a summer morning, just two strangers making small talk, just wind moving through an orchard, carrying smells that had been there long before any of them and would remain long after. James looked at Elizabeth, really looked at her, saw past the expensive clothes and perfect hair to the woman underneath, saw the exhaustion around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands rested in her lap, fingers laced together, knuckles pale with pressure. No. The word was simple, final, the kind of no that did not invite negotiation. Elizabeth blinked, and recognition crossed her face. Not surprise exactly, but acknowledgement. In her world, James understood no was a tactic, a starting position, a problem to be solved with better terms or bigger numbers. But he had not said no because he wanted more. He had said no because there was nothing she could offer that he wanted. Elizabeth stood, smoothed her coat, nodded once, a gesture that managed to convey both disappointment and acknowledgement. She walked down the porch steps, and on the second one, the one James kept meaning to fix every Saturday and then forgetting, her heel caught and snapped. She stumbled forward. James moved without thinking, hand closing around her wrist before she could fall. They stood close enough that she felt the warmth radiating from him, her skin against his calloused palm. He could smell her perfume, floral and expensive, layered over the faint scent of coffee and stress. She could feel his pulse under her fingers, steady and strong, the pulse of a man who did not rattle easily. He let go first, stepped back, gestured to the broken step. "Careful! That step's been broken since last winter." Then he turned and walked inside, letting the screen door close behind him with a soft slap of wood against frame. He stood in the kitchen, hands braced against the counter, listening to the sound of the Escalade pulling away, gravel crunching under expensive tires. Emma came in a moment later, humming to herself, and went to the fridge for juice. "Did the princess leave?" "She's not a princess, baby, just someone who needed directions." Emma accepted this without question, the way children accepted most things adults told them, and wandered back outside to her drawing. James stayed where he was, staring at nothing, thinking about a woman in a cashmere coat asking him to sell his dignity for $200,000, thinking about how easy it would have been to say yes, how much that money could do, how many repairs it could fund, how much security it could buy, how many years it could stretch if managed carefully. But he had not built his life on what was easy. He had built it on what was right, and there was nothing right about pretending to love a stranger for money, no matter how politely the offer was framed. The Escalade disappeared down the dirt road, dust settling in its wake. Amanda sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone, not looking at Elizabeth. "Well, that went terribly." Elizabeth did not answer. She had opened a file on her iPad, the background report on James Williams, and was reading it again, more slowly this time. The way you reread a letter that changes meaning the second time through. James Williams, MIT, class of 2012, structural engineering degree, top 15% of his class, recruited by Morrison and Blake, one of the premier firms in Boston. Projects that included the Seaport Tower renovation, the Cambridge Biotech Complex, the residential high-rise in the financial district that had been featured in Architectural Digest. Salary in the high six figures, career trajectory pointing straight up. Then Michelle Williams. Williams, diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. James had resigned within a week of the diagnosis, sold their Back Bay apartment for below market value to close fast, liquidated everything, moved Michelle to her family's farm in Vermont, the place where she had grown up, where the air smelled like the air of her childhood, where she could see mountains from bed. After she died, James stayed, not because he could not go back, because he chose not to. Elizabeth closed the iPad and turned her face toward the window, watched the Vermont countryside slide past, green hills, white fences, barns with peeling paint, houses tucked into hollows, smoke rising from chimneys even in summer, a world that moved at a different speed, governed by rhythms she did not understand. He gave up everything for her. She said it quietly, almost to herself. Amanda heard it anyway, glanced over, her expression careful. "And you're asking him to pretend to love a stranger?" Elizabeth did not answer. She did not speak again until they reached the interstate. That evening, James put Emma to bed. He read her the same book she asked for every night, a story about a wild horse who finds its way home across mountains and rivers, learning along the way that home is not a place, but a feeling, and that the journey matters as much as the destination. Emma fell asleep before the ending, the way she always did, her breathing evening out into the soft rhythm of a child who felt safe. James kissed her forehead, turned off the light, stood in the doorway watching her sleep in the glow of the nightlight, shaped like a crescent moon. Then he went to sit on the porch. The sky over Vermont was enormous, crowded with stars the city had always hidden from him. He had forgotten about stars in Boston, forgotten that darkness could be something other than the absence of light, that silence could be full instead of empty. His phone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet. His mother, Patricia. She lived 12 miles away in the next town over, close enough to help, but far enough to give him space. Small towns worked that way. Everyone knew everything, usually before it happened. "You had a visitor today." James laughed, a real laugh, the first one in that conversation, and possibly the first real one in weeks. "News travels fast. Black Escalade on a dirt road tends to get noticed. Sally Morris saw it from her kitchen window, called me before they even made it to your driveway. So, who was she?" James told her the basics. CEO from Boston, marriage arrangement, money involved. He left out the details that did not matter, the specifics of the will, the exact dollar amount, the way Elizabeth Ashford had looked at him like he was a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be known. Patricia was quiet. Then, in the tone that told James she was about to say something he would not want to hear, but needed to anyway. "What did she look like?" James laughed again, this time with more warmth. "Mama, I'm serious. Humor me." He thought about it. The dark hair, the expensive coat, the way she had stood in the mud like it was a minor inconvenience rather than a fact that demanded adjustment. She looked like someone who's used to getting what she wants. And she wants you. She wants a husband on paper. There's a difference. Patricia made a sound that was neither agreement nor disagreement, the verbal equivalent of a shrug that meant she was reserving judgment. "James, you've been talking to that horse more than you've talked to any human being in the past year. I'm not saying take the deal. I'm saying maybe don't close every door just because the last one hurt." They talked a while longer. About Emma, about the farm, about the church potluck next Sunday. and whether James would actually show up this time or find another excuse. When they hung up, James walked back inside. On the kitchen table, he found the drawing Emma had made that afternoon. A tall woman in a blue dress, standing next to a horse. In Emma's careful, crooked letters, written across the bottom, "The Princess." James folded it, put it in a drawer, and went to bed. 3 days later, Elizabeth came back. She came alone this time. No driver, no Amanda, no Escalade. She pulled up in a rented sedan, a plain gray Toyota Camry that looked almost as out of place on the dirt road as the Cadillac had, though for entirely different reasons. She was wearing jeans and a light jacket. The jeans were clearly new, still creased from the packaging. The jacket still had a tag she had missed, tucked inside the collar. But the effort meant something. It was an effort she had never made for anyone. James was in the stable, brushing down Dutch. He heard the car, looked out, and saw her walking across the yard. He was surprised, but did not show it. He simply continued brushing, long, slow strokes along the horse's side, the rhythm meditative and familiar. Elizabeth stepped into the stable, her new flat shoes already stained with grass. The smell hit her. Hay, horse, old wood, leather. She stood there, adjusting, then spoke. "I'm not here to offer you money. I'm here because I don't know where else to go." Elizabeth did not negotiate this time. She talked. She told James about her father, how Henry Ashford had started with nothing, how he had built the company one building at a time, how he had been brilliant and stubborn and terrible at saying he loved her, but showed it in 1,000 small ways she only recognized after he was gone. The way he saved articles about her projects, the way he kept her first business proposal framed in his office, the way he called every Sunday at 9, even when he was traveling, even when she was busy, because Sunday at 9 was their time and he refused to let the world take it from them. She told James that the marriage clause was not about control. Her father had watched her work 80-hour weeks, cancel every vacation, end every relationship before it started. He was afraid she would die alone in a penthouse the same way he had died alone in a hospital room, because she had been overseas signing a deal and had not made it back in time. "I didn't make it back. He died asking the nurse where I was." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. They trembled slightly, fingers laced together, gripping each other for anchor. James stopped brushing. He stood with his hand on Dutch's side, looking at the ground. He knew that feeling, the weight of a loss that was not just grief, but guilt. The question that never fully went away, the one that woke you at 3 in the morning and followed you through every quiet moment. What could I have done differently? He did not offer comfort. He did not tell her it was not her fault, the way everyone always did, the way nobody ever believed. He just said, "Have you had breakfast?" Emma made the tea, warm water with honey in a plastic cup shaped like a horse, bright blue with a cartoon mane printed on the side. She explained very seriously that this was the best cup in the house, and that Elizabeth should feel honored to drink from it. Elizabeth drank all of it, every drop, sitting at the small kitchen table while Emma chattered about her drawings and copper and whether horses could fly if they tried hard enough. It was the most peaceful breakfast Elizabeth had had in years. No emails buzzing against the table, no assistant hovering with a schedule, no agenda. Just a little girl who believed in flying horses and a single father quietly making eggs at a stove with a crooked burner he kept meaning to repair. When Elizabeth stood to leave, James walked her to the car. The sun was higher now, warming the air, pulling moisture from the grass in faint wisps of steam. She stopped with her hand on the door handle, looking back at the house, at Emma on the porch with her crayons, at the barn where Dutch watched from his stall, at the mountains in the distance, blue and hazy and permanent. I won't take your money, but I'll think about it if you tell me one thing. Why does it have to be real enough that you drove 3 hours twice to ask a stranger? Elizabeth looked at Emma, at the little girl who had lost her mother and still believed in princesses, who drew pictures of horses and families and worlds where everything worked out if you colored inside the lines. Because my uncle will destroy everything my father built, and I can't let that happen. James called her that evening. She answered on the first ring, though she would never admit that she had been holding the phone for the better part of an hour, checking the screen every few minutes. He told her he would do it, but he had conditions. He would not accept money, not a dollar, not a cent. Emma would know Elizabeth as a friend of her father's, nothing more. No one would pressure his daughter to call anyone anything she did not choose to call them on her own. If, at any point, Emma was affected negatively, confused, upset, hurt in any way, he would walk away immediately. No discussion, no negotiation, and one final condition. Elizabeth had to come to the farm at least twice a month. If this marriage needed to convince anyone, it had to start with her knowing what his real life actually looked like, not the version in a background file. The version with mud and broken porch steps and a 6-year-old who asked 100 questions before breakfast. Elizabeth agreed to everything. And then, for the first time in her career, she found herself at the end of a negotiation with nothing left to say. There was no lawyer to finalize terms, no handshake across a conference table, no signatures on heavy paper, just James's voice through the phone in the dark. "I'll see you Saturday, Elizabeth." It was the first time he had used her name. She held the phone after he hung up, staring at the Boston skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, and realized she could not remember the last time someone had said her name like that, like it was something that mattered, like she was a person instead of a position. That night, Emma asked the question James had been expecting and dreading in equal measure. They were sitting on the couch, Emma in her pajamas with the dinosaurs on them, Copper sprawled across both their laps like a furry blanket. "Daddy, is the pretty lady going to be my new mommy?" James felt his chest tighten. He had known this was coming, had rehearsed answers in his head, but none of them felt adequate, now that the moment was here. "No, sweetheart, just a friend who needs help." Emma thought about this, her face serious in the way of children processing new information. "Does she need help finding her prince?" "Something like that." "Can we help her?" James pulled his daughter close, kissed the top of her head, breathed in the smell of her shampoo and the faint sweetness of childhood that he knew would not last forever, that was already slipping away faster than he could hold it. "Yeah, baby, I think we can." Saturday arrived with the kind of light that made Vermont look like something out of a postcard. Clear sky, cool air, the smell of pine and wet grass drifting through the open windows. Elizabeth drove up the dirt road in the Camry just after 7 in the morning, early enough that the world still felt new, like the day had not yet decided what it would become. James was at the fence line when she arrived, pouring grain into the trough for the horses. He wore the same thermal shirt from earlier in the week, jeans with dirt on the knees, boots that had seen better years. He did not wave or call out, just glanced up, registered her presence, and went back to his work. Elizabeth parked near the barn, got out, and walked toward him. The grass was wet with dew. By the time she reached the fence, her new shoes were soaked through. "You're early." "Couldn't sleep." James nodded, accepting this without comment. Dutch ambled over, massive and patient, and pushed his nose against James's shoulder. Elizabeth watched from a careful distance, aware of the animal's size, the power in its legs, the sheer weight of muscle and bone that could crush a person without meaning to. "You ever been around horses?" "No." "Want to meet one?" She hesitated. James saw it, the flicker of uncertainty, the calculation behind her eyes. Then she nodded. He held out his hand. She took it. He led her to the fence, showed her how to hold her palm flat, fingers together, so the horse could take the apple slice without catching skin. Dutch's breath was warm and sweet, his lips soft against her hand. Elizabeth stood very still, barely breathing, and when the apple was gone, she exhaled like she had been holding it for hours. They walked the property together. James showed her where the fence needed reinforcing, where the deer came through in autumn, where the creek flooded every spring and turned the lower pasture into a temporary lake. He pointed to a row of sunflowers near the eastern edge, tall stalks heavy with seed heads. Michelle planted those. They come back every year on their own. Elizabeth looked at the flowers, at the way they turned their faces toward the sun, stubborn and persistent. You must miss her every day. It was the kind of honesty that did not ask for sympathy, that simply stated fact and left it there. Elizabeth did not try to fill the silence with platitudes or reassurances. She just walked beside him, listening to the crunch of gravel under their feet, the wind moving through the trees, the sound of Emma's laughter from somewhere near the house. They found Emma in the stable, sitting cross-legged in an empty stall, Copper beside her and a sketchbook on her lap. She looked up when they entered, eyes bright. "Elizabeth, you came back." "I did. Want to see Dutch eat? He's really good at it." James caught Elizabeth's eye, a question there. She nodded. Emma jumped up, took Elizabeth's hand with the easy confidence of a child who had not yet learned that adults could be dangerous, and led her to Dutch's stall. She explained in great detail the proper way to feed a horse, how to keep your hand flat, how to talk to them so they knew you were friendly, how Dutch liked apples but loved carrots, and would do almost anything for a sugar cube. Elizabeth crouched down, listening with an attention she usually reserved for board meetings, and when Emma placed her hand on the horse's nose, guiding her fingers along the soft velvet, Elizabeth's shoulders dropped, the tension draining from muscles she had held rigid for so long she'd forgotten what relaxed felt like. "See? He's gentle, just like Daddy." The day passed in small increments. James fixed a section of fence while Elizabeth watched, then handed her a hammer and let her try. She was terrible at it, missing the nail more often than hitting it, but she kept trying until she got 3 nails flush with the wood. Emma brought them lunch on the porch, sandwiches made with more enthusiasm than skill, peanut butter and jelly sliding out the sides, but they ate them anyway, and Emma beamed like she had just prepared a feast. In the afternoon, James went inside to catch up on paperwork, the endless administrative burden of running a farm. Elizabeth stayed on the porch with Emma, coloring in a book about ocean animals. Emma talked without pause, explaining the scientific names of fish she had learned from a documentary, describing in elaborate detail the life cycle of a sea turtle, asking questions Elizabeth could not answer about whether whales had friends and if dolphins could understand human languages. When the sun started to sink, painting the mountains gold and orange, James came back out. Emma had fallen asleep on the porch swing, her head on Elizabeth's lap, the coloring book abandoned on the floor. Elizabeth sat very still, one hand resting lightly on Emma's shoulder, afraid to move and wake her. James lifted his daughter carefully, feeling her weight settle against his chest with the particular trust children have in sleep. He carried her inside, tucked her into bed, even though it was early, because some days exhausted you in the best way, and sleep was the body's way of processing joy. When he came back out, Elizabeth was still on the swing, staring at the horizon. "She's amazing." "She is." "Does she know about Michelle? I mean, does she remember her?" James sat in the chair opposite, the wood creaking under his weight. "Some. She was 2 when Michelle got diagnosed, 4 when she died. She remembers moments more than the person, the smell of her perfume, the way she sang in the kitchen. Michelle used to make up songs about everything, grocery lists, traffic jams, the weather. Emma still does that sometimes, makes up songs. I think it's her way of keeping her mother close. Elizabeth was quiet for a long time. The sky deepened, blue bleeding into purple, stars appearing one by one like punctuation marks in a sentence written across the heavens. I don't know how to do this, any of this. Do what? Be here. Be still. Just exist without a plan or a meeting or a deliverable. James leaned back, laced his fingers behind his head. It gets easier. Or maybe you just get used to it. Hard to say. They sat together in the quiet, not the awkward silence of strangers searching for conversation, but the shared peace of 2 people who had each carried burdens for so long they had forgotten what it felt like to set them down, and finding that the ground could hold both. The cold came on fast once the sun dropped. James went inside, grabbed a flannel shirt from the hook by the door, and brought it out to Elizabeth without a word. She put it on. It was enormous on her, sleeves hanging past her fingers, smelling of wood smoke and apples and soap. She pulled it tight and felt warmer than she had in months. Her phone shattered the moment, the ringtone loud and jarring, a sound that belonged to a different world. Elizabeth looked at the screen. Amanda, she answered. Amanda's voice was tense, clipped in a way that meant controlled alarm. He knows. What? Richard. He knows you've been coming to Vermont. Multiple trips in the past week. He's already investigating. Whatever you're planning, you need to move fast. Elizabeth closed her eyes and felt the burden return, heavier now because she had tasted what it felt like to set it down. How long do we have? I don't know, but he's putting pieces together, and when he does, he's not going to be quiet about it. They spoke for a few more minutes, logistics and contingencies, the language of crisis management that Elizabeth knew by heart. When she hung up, James was watching her. Trouble? My uncle knows I've been coming here. He's going to make this difficult. More difficult than it already is? She almost smiled. Yes. James stood, walked to the porch railing, looked out at the dark shapes of the mountains against the darker sky. We knew this wasn't going to be easy. Knowing it and living it are different things. They usually are. Elizabeth drove back to Boston that night, the highway empty and dark, the kind of drive where you could lose yourself in the rhythm of the road and the glow of the dashboard and the thoughts you kept at bay during daylight. She thought about Emma's hand in hers, about the way James moved through the world with such quiet certainty, about the flannel shirt folded on the passenger seat, smelling of a life she did not know how to want but could not stop thinking about. Monday morning came too fast. Elizabeth was back in her office, 40 stories above the city, fielding calls and reviewing contracts and pretending the weekend had not happened. But it had. And she could not unknow the feel of a horse's breath on her palm, or the sound of a 6-year-old's laughter, or the weight of silence that was not loneliness, but peace. Tuesday, late morning, the call came. James's number on her screen. She answered before the second ring, heart already accelerating. James? His voice was wrong, too tight, stripped of the easy calm she had come to associate with him. It's Emma. Elizabeth stood, the chair rolling back, phone pressed hard against her ear. What happened? She collapsed at school. Lunch recess. They called me from the nurse's office. I'm heading there now. She's awake, but her heart rate's elevated. They want me to take her to Burlington, get her checked out. I'm coming. Elizabeth, you don't have to. I'm coming. She hung up, grabbed her coat, told Amanda to cancel everything for the rest of the day and possibly tomorrow. She was in her car and on the highway before she allowed herself to think about what she was doing. 3 hours, Boston to Hartfield. She had driven it once as a careful visit, once as a tentative second chance. Now she drove it like a woman outrunning something, though she could not have said what. She arrived at the farm just after 6. The house was lit up, every window glowing. James's truck was in the driveway. Elizabeth parked beside it, got out, and walked to the door. It opened before she could knock. James stood there, and Elizabeth saw immediately how scared he was. Not panicking, not falling apart, but scared in the deep way parents get scared when the thing they love most in the world becomes fragile in their hands. "How is she?" "Resting," Dr. Foster said, the murmurs acting up. "Stress triggered it. She wants to monitor Emma more closely for the next few weeks." Elizabeth stepped inside. The house smelled like dinner, something simple. Pasta, maybe. Emma was on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching a movie with the sound low. She looked up when Elizabeth entered, and her face lit up. "You came." "Of course I came." Elizabeth sat on the edge of the couch. Emma shifted, making room, and Elizabeth found herself holding a small, warm body against her side, feeling the rise and fall of breathing that was a little too fast but steady, alive, here. They watched the movie, some animated thing about talking animals and friendship and believing in yourself. Emma fell asleep halfway through, her head on Elizabeth's shoulder. James sat in the chair across from them, watching not the screen but his daughter, counting breaths the way he had counted them since the day she was born, a ritual of reassurance that never quite stopped the fear. When the movie ended, James carried Emma to bed. Elizabeth stayed on the couch, hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. She heard him in the other room, the soft murmur of his voice, the creak of the bed, the click of the door closing gently. He came back and sat beside her. Not in the chair this time, beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Thank you for coming." "I couldn't not come." He looked at her then, really looked, and Elizabeth felt recognition pass between them, an understanding that this had stopped being about contracts or arrangements or convenient solutions to complicated problems. "I lost Michelle? I can't lose Emma?" His voice broke on the last word, just slightly, a hairline fracture in the foundation. Elizabeth did something she had not done in years. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers were rough, scarred from work and weather. Hers were soft, unmarked. They fit together anyway. "You won't, I promise." "How can you promise that?" The question was raw, desperate, the question of a man who had already learned that promises meant nothing against the indifference of biology and fate. Elizabeth tightened her grip. "Because I'm not leaving. Not you, not her." James turned to face her fully, his eyes searching hers for proof that words could mean what they claimed to mean. "Say it again." The words came out quiet, but they were not a request. They were a demand, a test, a line drawn in the space between them. Elizabeth held his gaze. "I'm not leaving." "Look at me when you say it." She was already looking, but she understood what he meant. He needed to see her, needed to read the truth, or lie in her face, needed to know if this was real, or if it was just another negotiation, another performance, another contract dressed up in pretty words. "I'm not leaving you." The kiss happened without planning, without the careful choreography of intention. One moment they were sitting there, hands clasped, eyes locked. The next, James leaned forward, and Elizabeth met him halfway, and their mouths found each other in the dim light of a farmhouse kitchen at 2 a.m. It was not gentle. It was not tentative. It was the kiss of two people who had spent too long holding everything together and had just discovered they did not have to do it alone. When they broke apart, Elizabeth was breathing hard, her hand on his chest, feeling his heart hammer against her palm. Sometimes the person who saves you is the one you weren't looking for. They sat together until the sky started to lighten, talking in low voices about things that mattered and things that did not. James told her about the early days with Emma, the terror of being a single father to an infant, the way he had learned to change diapers and mix formula and interpret different types of crying. Elizabeth told him about her father, about the way he used to take her to construction sites when she was young, letting her wear a tiny hard hat and carry blueprints that were bigger than she was, teaching her to see buildings, not as structures, but as possibilities. When Elizabeth finally left, the sun was coming up. She drove back to Boston in a daze, running on no sleep and too much feeling. And when she walked into her office that afternoon, Amanda took one look at her and said, "You're in trouble." "I know." 5 days before the deadline, a silver Mercedes appeared on the dirt road. It was not Elizabeth's car. Richard Ashford stepped out alone. No lawyer, no assistant, no entourage. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a pressed shirt, and he looked at the farm the way a man looks at something mildly distasteful, but too polished to say so directly. He checked his watch, straightened his cuffs, waited. James returned 20 minutes later, Emma beside him in the truck, backpack covered in horse stickers. He saw the Mercedes, saw the man standing beside it, and felt ice spread through his ribs, a warning his body registered before his mind caught up, sharp, cold, undeniable. He parked, got out, lifted Emma down. She ran toward the porch, unaware of anything wrong, just a child coming home on a Tuesday afternoon. James stayed by the truck. Richard introduced himself with a handshake that was firm and practiced, the kind of handshake men learn in boardrooms and keep forever. His voice was warm, measured, the voice of a man accustomed to charity dinners and corporate retreats and getting exactly what he wanted while making it sound like a favor. "Mr. Williams, I'm Richard Ashford, Elizabeth's uncle. I wonder if we might have a word." James did not invite him inside, did not offer coffee or small talk or any of the courtesies he might have extended to someone who had come in good faith. He simply crossed his arms and waited. Richard told him he knew everything, the arrangement, the planned marriage, all of it. He said he did not blame James. He said he understood how a man in James's position might find the offer appealing. A single father, a sick child, medical bills, the kind of financial pressure that made people do things they would not otherwise consider. Then his tone shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a blade turning beneath silk. "A man raising a little girl alone on a farm. That's admirable, Mr. Williams. Truly. I'd hate to see that arrangement complicated by a fraud investigation. Family courts don't look kindly on fathers involved in legal scandals. Custody evaluations can be very thorough, very public." The words landed exactly where Richard intended them. James felt the foundation shift beneath him, not the literal earth, but the bedrock of everything he had built his life around since Michelle died. Emma was his reason. She was why he woke up, why he stayed, why the quiet was bearable instead of suffocating. The thought of losing her made his blood run cold. The thought of some courtroom deciding he was unfit, of a judge questioning the stability of a single father on a remote farm, of people who did not know him or Emma or what they had survived together, making decisions about whether he deserved to keep his daughter. He knew too well what it meant to be a black man standing in spaces where other people got to define what stability looked like. Emma appeared at the screen door, voice bright and curious. "Daddy, who's that man?" James squeezed the truck key in his hand, until the metal bit into his palm, felt the pain, used it to anchor himself. "Nobody, sweetheart. Go inside and wash up for dinner." She disappeared back into the house, obedient in the way of children who trusted their parents to keep them safe. Richard left his business card on the fence post and drove away without another word. Mission accomplished. Damage done. James stood in the driveway until the sound of the engine faded behind the hill. Then he went inside, made Emma dinner, helped her with her spelling worksheet, the words swimming in front of his eyes while he forced himself to focus. Read her a story about a bear learning to count, his voice steady even though his hands wanted to shake. Tucked her in, kissed her forehead, turned off the light. He stood in her doorway for a long time, listening to her breathe. Then he sat on the edge of his own bed and called Elizabeth. His voice, when she answered, was flat, emptied of everything that had been building between them over the past 2 weeks. Elizabeth heard it immediately. Not anger, fear, the kind of fear that lives in the place where a parent keeps the worst possibilities locked away. "I can't risk Emma." She knew immediately what Richard had done. She had spent her entire adult life anticipating the moves of men like her uncle, reading the calculations behind their smiles. "What did he say?" James told her. Every word, every implication. The custody threat delivered with surgical precision. The reminder that courts and investigations were public, that scandals followed people, that a single father raising a sick child on an isolated farm might face questions he could not afford to answer. When he finished, Elizabeth was quiet. James waited for her to argue, to persuade, to deploy the CEO who could talk anyone into anything. Instead, she said something he did not expect. "If walking away keeps Emma safe, then walk away. I will never ask you to risk your daughter for me." James hung up. He sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about the choice Richard had forced on him. Safety or truth, his daughter's future or his word, the known path or the uncertain one. Elizabeth sat in her penthouse, 42 floors above Boston, looking out at a city she had conquered and controlled, and cried. Not for the company, not for the deadline ticking down, for something she had not expected to find in a farmhouse in Vermont, and was now losing before she had even learned what to call it. 2 days passed. James did not call, did not text, retreated into the routine with grim efficiency, a man pulling back to familiar ground because familiar was safe and safe was all he could afford. He fed the horses at dawn, fixed fence posts that did not need fixing, made Emma's lunches with mechanical precision, packing carrot sticks and sandwiches cut into triangles, adding notes on napkins that said things like, "Have a great day," and "You're amazing," because those were the things good fathers did, and he needed to be a good father, needed to prove it, needed to show anyone who might be watching that he was capable and stable and deserving. Emma asked once where Elizabeth was. James told her she was busy with work. Emma accepted this without question, the way children accepted most things, and went back to her drawings. Patricia showed up Sunday morning. She walked into the kitchen without knocking, saw her son standing at the sink washing dishes he had already washed twice, and recognized immediately what he was doing. "You're doing it again." James did not look up. "Doing what?" Patricia sat at the table, folded her hands in a way that meant she was settling in, and he was going to listen whether he wanted to or not. "You're calling it protecting Emma, but you're protecting yourself. That little girl doesn't need a father who's too scared to live." James turned around, the dish towel still in his hands. "I'm not scared. I'm being realistic." Patricia looked at her son with the expression only a mother can give, the one that says, "I see through every wall you've ever built, and I love you too much to let you hide behind them." "Realistic? You moved heaven and earth for Michelle. You sold everything you owned. You carried her through 18 months of chemotherapy. You held her hand the night she went. That wasn't safe, James. That wasn't realistic. That was love. And you survived it. You'll survive this too. Makes you wonder how often we choose safety over truth because we're scared of losing again. Patricia did not say it, but the words hung in the air anyway, a question neither of them wanted to answer. In Boston, Elizabeth sat with her legal team in a glass-walled conference room 32 floors above the city. They were preparing for the worst, full transfer of controlling interest to Richard. Transition protocols, minority shareholder protections. The lawyers spoke in measured tones, clinical and detached, as if they were discussing a merger and not the dismantling of everything her father had built. Amanda asked if Elizabeth wanted to find another candidate. There was still time. Another man, another contract, another arrangement. 5 days was tight but doable if they moved fast. Elizabeth said no. Amanda stared at her. Why not? There's still time. Elizabeth did not answer, but the answer was written across her face as clearly as if she had spoken it aloud. She did not want anyone else. That afternoon, James picked Emma up from a playdate at her friend Sarah's house. Sarah's mother handed him a drawing Emma had made during free time, something she did whenever she had crayons and paper and a few minutes to think. 3 people standing in front of a house. A tall man with dark skin and kind eyes. A small girl with curly hair, holding something that might have been a flower or might have been a star, hard to tell with 6-year-old precision. And a woman with long dark hair, standing close enough that their hands were touching. Sarah's mother had written a note at the bottom in her careful teacher's handwriting. Emma says the woman is Daddy's friend who smells nice and is scared of horses. James sat in his truck in the driveway of Sarah's house, engine off, holding the drawing. The 3 figures looked happy. The house looked solid. The sky was blue, and the sun was a yellow circle in the corner, and everything was simple and clear in the way things are simple and clear when you are 6 and believe that love is enough, and families are built from wanting them to be real. He folded the drawing carefully, put it in his jacket pocket, left side, over his heart. Then he took out his phone. He did not call Elizabeth. He called Amanda. What time is her birthday? Elizabeth arrived at the farm at dawn on her 33rd birthday. She had not told James she was coming. Amanda had driven her because Elizabeth had not slept in 2 days, and Amanda had refused to let her get behind the wheel in that condition. A hired driver followed in a separate car, silent and professional, waiting for instructions that might never come. Elizabeth stepped out into air that smelled of pine and wet earth and possibilities ending. The fog had not yet burned off. The orchard was silver and gray, trees standing like quiet witnesses to something they had seen before and would see again, the way trees witness everything without judgment or memory. James was by the fence doing exactly what he had been doing the first time she arrived, feeding Dutch, one hand on the horse's neck, steady and unhurried. But this time, when she walked toward him, he turned immediately. His eyes met hers, and he did not look away. Elizabeth stopped a few feet from him. Her voice was steady, but it was not the voice of a CEO. It was the voice of a woman standing in a field at sunrise with nothing left to hide behind. I'm not here to ask you anything. I just wanted to see this place one more time. She paused, gathering words that felt too big for her throat. I need a husband by tomorrow, but I'd rather lose the company than lose whatever this was. James stepped forward. His hands were dirty from morning work. There was hay on his sleeve and mud on his boots, and he looked at her the way he had not looked at anyone in 4 years. Without caution, without the careful distance he had maintained like armor since the day he buried his wife. "Then kiss me right now." Elizabeth did not move. Behind her, Amanda made a sound halfway between a gasp and a laugh. The driver fumbled with his phone, nearly dropping it. James spoke again, his voice holding the certainty of a man who had made his choice and would live with whatever came after. "Not for the contract, not for the board, not for your uncle. If we're doing this, I need to know it's real. So kiss me and mean it." She kissed him, in the apple orchard, in the early Vermont light, with fog still curling through the trees and Dutch watching from the fence with mild equine disinterest. Her hands gripped the front of his flannel shirt. His hand came up to the side of her face, rough fingers against her cheek, calluses catching on skin that had never known work like his. No performance, no strategy, just the first honest thing either had allowed themselves in years. That afternoon they drove to the Colton Town Hall, a small white building with a flag out front and a parking lot that held 6 cars when it was busy, 3 when it was not. Today it held 4. James wore a clean shirt, dark blue and pressed, the only dress shirt he owned. Elizabeth wore the jeans from her second visit, the ones that finally had real dirt worked into the denim, and a simple white blouse she had packed, thinking she might need something that was not cashmere or silk. Patricia came in her best dress, navy blue with small buttons, the one she saved for Easter and funerals and, apparently, days when her son decided to come back to life. She was crying before they even got inside, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she kept pulling from her purse, trying to be subtle about it and failing completely. Emma carried a wildflower James had picked from the roadside ditch on the way over, a single purple aster slightly bent at the stem, but still bright, still holding its color against the odds. She clutched it like a scepter, like something precious and official. The town clerk was a woman named Dorothy, who had known James since he was a boy, running barefoot through the general store, stealing penny candy and returning it the next day with a nickel because his mother had taught him that honesty mattered more than sugar. Dorothy looked at Elizabeth, looked at James, looked at Emma holding both their hands, and smiled the knowing smile of someone who had married enough couples to recognize love when it showed up, even when it showed up wearing dirt and desperation and hope. "Well, it's about time." The paperwork took 11 minutes. There was no music, no photographer, no reception planned. When they walked back outside into the afternoon sun, Patricia took a photo on her old phone, the kind with the cracked screen protector she refused to replace because the phone still worked, and working was what mattered. James was holding Elizabeth's hand. Emma was holding the other one. The aster was already wilting in the heat, petals curling inward, but Emma held it like it was still perfect, like wilting was just another stage of being beautiful. On the drive home, Elizabeth's phone rang. Amanda's name on the screen. Elizabeth answered. Amanda's voice was tight, controlled in the way it got when bad news needed delivering quickly. "He knows. Richard knows about the wedding. He's scheduling a press conference at Ashford Properties headquarters tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. He has documentation. He has a narrative. He's going to tear you apart in public." Elizabeth closed her eyes and felt the burden return, familiar and heavy as winter. How did he find out so fast? Does it matter? He knows, and he's moving. They talked through logistics, damage control, talking points, the mechanical language of crisis management that Elizabeth knew by heart because she had spent a decade learning to navigate disasters before they became catastrophes. When she hung up, James glanced over from the driver's seat. "What's the plan?" "We show up, we tell the truth, we let the chips fall." He nodded, accepting this, and Emma hummed in the back seat, oblivious and safe in the way children are safe when the adults around them are determined to keep them that way. The next morning, the sidewalk in front of the Ashford Properties Tower was crowded with reporters and camera crews, vans with satellite dishes, photographers jostling for position, the kind of media circus that assembled when blood was in the water and everyone wanted to watch the feeding. Richard Ashford stood behind a podium that had been set up with careful staging, the company logo behind him, positioned so every camera would capture it. His expression was grave, concerned, the performance of a man reluctantly doing the right thing even though it pained him. He presented his evidence methodically. Elizabeth had traveled to rural Vermont multiple times in recent weeks. She had entered into an arrangement with a farmer, a man completely disconnected from her social and professional circles. He produced a timeline, travel records, photographs taken by a private investigator Richard had hired the moment he suspected something was wrong. The marriage, he declared with practiced regret, was a sham, a fraud designed to circumvent the legitimate terms of Henry Ashford's will, his brother's will, a document meant to protect the company Henry had built from the ground up, meant to ensure leadership that was grounded in family values and personal commitment, not legal loopholes and desperate maneuvers. The reporters wrote furiously. Cameras clicked in a frenzy. Richard was in control, and he knew it. He had spent months preparing for this moment, positioning himself as the responsible steward, the man who would honor his brother's legacy even if it meant opposing his own niece. Then the glass doors of the building opened, and Elizabeth stepped out. She was dressed impeccably. Sharp blazer, dark blouse, hair pulled back in a way that said, business, not apology. Every inch the CEO her father had raised her to be. She walked toward the podium with measured stride, the kind of walk that comes from a decade of commanding rooms full of men who underestimated her and learning to make them regret it. But before she reached the microphone, James stepped forward. No one had invited him to speak. No one had coached him or prepared remarks or told him what to say. He simply walked past Elizabeth, past the podium where Richard stood with barely concealed surprise, and stood in front of the cameras. He was wearing the same boots he wore on the farm, the jeans he had worn yesterday, clean but not pressed, a shirt that had cost $30 at a store in Burlington. His hands were clean, but the calluses were visible, evidence of work Richard Ashford would never understand or value. He looked profoundly out of place among the glass and steel and expensive suits, and he did not care at all. Everything he just said is true. James let the silence settle. Let them absorb it. Let the implications wash over the crowd like a wave. She came to my farm with an offer, a business arrangement, a contract. She offered me $200,000 to marry her for 12 months. The murmur passed through the reporters like wind through grass, bending and shifting, gaining momentum. I said no. Another pause, deliberate and controlled. I turned down the money, every dollar of it. Because I have dignity, I deserve respect. I don't take payment to pretend to be something I'm not. James told them he had been an engineer once, that he had lived in Boston, worked in a glass tower not unlike this one, that he had given it all up when his wife got sick, because being with her mattered more than being successful, that after she died, he had stayed on her family's farm because he wanted to raise his daughter in the place her mother had loved most, that he was not ashamed of any of it, not the dirt under his nails, not the farm, not the life he had chosen over the life that looked good on paper. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the drawing Emma had made. He unfolded it carefully, holding it the way you hold something fragile and irreplaceable. My daughter drew this at school last week. 3 people in front of a house, me, her, and a woman she calls Daddy's friend. He held it up, and the cameras captured it. A child's crayon drawing, simple and bright and honest. The kind of thing that hangs on refrigerators in kitchens across America, held up with magnets shaped like fruit or cartoon characters, visible proof that love existed in small acts of creation. I'm standing here because I don't want to tell my little girl that the woman in her picture isn't real. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is admit he needs someone. The reporters went quiet. Richard's jaw tightened, the only visible crack in his composure. Elizabeth stepped to the microphone then, and the CEO was fully present. Sharp, prepared, unwavering. She did not talk about love or feelings or the farm in Vermont. She talked about fiduciary duty. She presented documentation her legal team had assembled over the past 11 months, evidence that Richard had systematically pressured minority shareholders into proxy agreements that gave him voting power he should not have had. Board votes manipulated through procedural technicalities, company resources redirected for personal investments, unauthorized commitments made using the Ashford name, binding the company to deals that benefited Richard's portfolio more than the company's bottom line. She had known about all of it for nearly a year, had held the evidence back because she had not wanted to tear her family apart in public, because, despite everything, Richard was still her father's brother, still the man who had taught her to ride a bike and shown up at her college graduation when Henry was overseas closing a deal. But Richard had made that decision for her, had weaponized her marriage, had threatened a good man and a sick child, had forced her hand. The board convened an emergency meeting that afternoon in the 32nd floor conference room. The vote of no confidence against Richard was unanimous. Elizabeth retained full control of Ashford Properties, not because of the marriage, but because of the evidence of fraud and her own strategic preparation. The marriage was legally valid, but the company was saved by her competence, not by a contract. Richard left the building without speaking to anyone. He would resign from the board within the week. His career in the industry was effectively over. No one forgave the kind of betrayal he had attempted, and no one forgot. 6 months later, the farm looked the way it had always looked, except for small differences that only someone paying close attention would notice. There was a laptop on the kitchen table most mornings, opened to spreadsheets and email chains, sitting beside a shoebox of crayons and a half-finished drawing of a horse with improbably long legs. There was a second coffee mug on the porch railing, not the thermos James used, but a white ceramic one from a Boston cafe, with a chip on the handle that Elizabeth refused to replace because it reminded her of the first morning she had stayed over, the first time she had woken up to the sound of roosters instead of traffic. There was a pair of flat shoes by the door that were no longer new, their soles dark with honest Vermont mud, the kind of dirt that came from walking fence lines and feeding horses and learning that work could be meditation if you let it. Elizabeth still ran Ashford Properties, still took calls in the kitchen, still reviewed contracts on her phone while sitting on the porch steps with Copper asleep at her feet. But every Friday afternoon she drove 3 hours north, and every Sunday evening she drove 3 hours south, and the distance between those two lives grew a little shorter each week. Her hands were developing small calluses from helping James repair the fence, a project he kept insisting she did not need to help with, and that she kept insisting on doing anyway, mostly because she liked working beside him in the quiet, liked the simple mathematics of physical labor, liked the proof that she could be useful in ways that had nothing to do with her title or her bank account. James did not move to Boston. Elizabeth did not ask him to. They lived between two worlds, Not perfectly, not seamlessly, but honestly. And honest, they had learned, was enough. Some evenings, Elizabeth sat on the kitchen floor with Emma, coloring in books about ocean animals and forest creatures and distant planets. Emma would look up mid-crayon, face serious with the weight of important questions, and ask things like, "Elizabeth, what does acquisition mean?" Elizabeth would explain it in the simplest terms she could find, using examples Emma might understand. Companies buying other companies, like when you trade your apple slices for your friend's cookies, except bigger and with more paperwork. Emma would nod seriously, processing this, and go back to coloring a whale bright purple because whales, in Emma's world, could be any color they wanted. On one such evening, with autumn settling over the orchard and the trees turning gold and amber and deep red, Emma set down her crayon and looked at Elizabeth with the direct, unfiltered gaze children have before they learn to hide what they are thinking. "Elizabeth, do you love my daddy?" Elizabeth stopped coloring, set down her own crayon, a green one she had been using for seaweed that probably was not actually green, but Emma had not corrected her, so maybe seaweed could be green in this particular ocean. "Yes, I do." Emma smiled, gap-toothed and easy. "Good. Mommy would like you. You make Daddy smile again." Tears burned behind Elizabeth's eyes, sudden and sharp. She reached out and pulled Emma into a hug, holding her the way you hold something precious and temporary, and yours, for exactly as long as you get to keep it. Later, after Emma was asleep, James and Elizabeth sat on the porch in the two wooden chairs he had built the winter after Michelle died. The planter box beside them was still full of flowers, the ones that came back every year without anyone tending them. Purple and white blooms, stubborn and faithful, the way love sometimes is when you stop trying to control it and just let it grow. Elizabeth looked at James across the small distance that separated their chairs. "I still can't believe you told me to kiss you, in front of Amanda and the driver." James smiled, that rare, slow smile that still made her breath catch, even now, even after months of seeing it, even after learning its contours and meanings. "I can't believe you actually did." They sat in the comfortable silence of people who had learned they did not need to fill every moment with words. Then James reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand. "I need to tell you something. This stopped being an arrangement the night you drove 3 hours because Emma was sick. I don't want this to be an act anymore." Elizabeth tightened her grip on his fingers, feeling the calluses, the scars, the evidence of a life lived fully and honestly. "It never was, not for me." From inside the house, Emma's voice rang out, sharp with impatience, and completely unimpressed by adult romance and its glacial pace. "Stop being weird. The movie's starting." They stood, still holding hands, and walked inside together. The flowers kept blooming beside the empty chairs. Inside, Emma had already claimed the best spot on the couch, Copper curled at her feet in a puddle of golden fur, the remote clutched in her small hand like a trophy. 3 people, 1 farmhouse, a life that was not perfect, not a fairy tale, but full, finally, honestly, completely. James sat on one side of Emma, Elizabeth sat on the other. Somewhere in the middle of the movie, Emma shifted, leaning against Elizabeth's shoulder, and Elizabeth felt the weight of trust that children give so easily when they feel safe. She looked across Emma's curls at James and found him already looking at her, his expression soft with contentment and peace woven together. Emma had a new drawing taped to the refrigerator, 4 people this time, the 3 they had been, plus a small addition. A baby bump barely visible under Elizabeth's drawn shirt, rendered in pink crayon with the optimistic certainty that came from overhearing adult conversations and filling in the blanks with hope. James had seen it that morning, had not said anything, had just smiled and kissed the top of Emma's head and made her breakfast like every other day. But Elizabeth had caught him looking at it when he thought she was not watching, his hand resting briefly on his chest, right over his heart, in the place where he kept Emma's first drawing folded in his jacket pocket. The movie played, some animated thing about friendship and adventure and believing in yourself even when the world says you cannot. Emma laughed at the funny parts and hid her face during the scary parts and narrated along with the dialogue she had memorized from watching it 17 times before. When the credits rolled, Emma was already asleep, head on Elizabeth's lap, breathing steady and deep. James lifted her carefully, carried her to bed, tucked her in with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more. He kissed her forehead, whispered that he loved her, and turned off the light. In the kitchen, Elizabeth was washing the popcorn bowls they had used, sleeves pushed up, hair falling out of its twist. James stood in the doorway, just watching, memorizing, banking the image against future need. She looked up, caught him staring, raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Nothing. Just thinking." "About what?" "About how I almost said no. How close I came to missing this." Elizabeth dried her hands on the dish towel, walked over to him, stood close enough that he could smell her shampoo, something floral that had replaced the expensive perfume she used to wear. "But you didn't. You said yes. Eventually. Eventually." She kissed him then, soft and quick, the kind of kiss that was punctuation rather than poetry, the kind that said, "I'm here and you're here and that's enough." Outside, the stars were coming out, the same stars that had been there when James first moved to the farm, when Michelle was still alive, when Emma was a baby who cried at night and James had walked the porch at 3 in the morning, bouncing her against his shoulder, whispering promises he had not known if he could keep. The same stars that had watched him bury his wife, that had seen him collapse in the barn the day after the funeral and cry until there was nothing left inside him but hollow ache, that had witnessed him learning to be a single father, to cook meals and braid hair and answer questions he had no answers for. The same stars that had been there the morning Elizabeth Ashford arrived in a Cadillac Escalade, looking like she had wandered in from another planet, asking for something James did not know how to give. They were still there, patient, indifferent, beautiful in their distance. It makes you wonder, how often do we mistake quiet strength for weakness? How many times have we judged a single parent without knowing their story? Elizabeth came up behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, rested her chin on his shoulder. They stood together in the doorway, looking out at the night, at the porch that still needed paint, and the fence that still needed repairs, and the 100 small tasks that would never be finished because farms, like lives, were works in progress. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything. Nothing. How we got here." "Regrets?" "Not a single one." She kissed the side of his neck, a gesture of affection and comfort and solidarity. "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." "I know." And he did know, had known it since the night she drove 3 hours in the dark because Emma was sick, had known it when she kissed him in the apple orchard with fog still clinging to the trees, had known it when she stood beside him at the town hall and married him in 11 minutes with a wilted flower and a 6-year-old as witnesses, had known it in the way she learned to feed horses and fix fences and sit still in silence, in the way she colored with Emma and listened to stories about talking whales and made tea in plastic cups shaped like animals, in the way she had looked at him across the porch that first Saturday exhausted and uncertain, and searching for something she had not known she needed. Many people in power think a single dad will fold the moment they whisper courts and scandal. They pressure with threats and posture with paperwork. They weaponize the story for leverage and weaponize the truth for control. But James had not folded, had stood in front of cameras and shown them Emma's drawing, and told the truth without apology or shame, had let the world see him as he was, a single father raising a sick child on a farm in Vermont, loving them both with everything he had. And it had been enough, more than enough. It had been everything. What would you have done in his place when it was his daughter on the line? The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable, because there was no right answer, just choices and consequences, and the hope that you chose well. In the end, it was the child's drawing and the fraud evidence that told the truth. And when the truth wins, it protects what matters most: family.